Welcome back, Global Watchers. The 2025 Global Terrorism Index has just dropped, and it's a doozy. This year, we're diving deep into its findings, but we're not stopping there. To unpack the full picture, we'll cross-reference insights from Europol's report, the Fragile States Index Annual Report, the IOSS Armed Conflict Survey, and the U.S. Homeland Security Terrorist Threat Snapshot. Think of it as a 360-degree view of a world on edge, ready to connect the dots. Let's deep dive.
Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into a topic that never seemed to get any easier.
Always a pleasure to be here, though you're not wrong about the not easy part.
No kidding. Okay, so Global Terrorism 2025, big topic, complex picture. Luckily, we've got the 2025 Global Terrorism Index, the GTI, to help guide us.
Absolutely. The GTI is always a great starting point. And we'll be weaving in some other reports, too, for that, like you said, complex picture.
Perfect. So before we get too deep in the weeds, what's the big picture? What's jumping out at you from the 2025 GTI?
Well, the world's in a pretty volatile state right now, wouldn't you say?
Oh, without a doubt.
Absolutely.
Politically, economically, throw in climate change for good measure.
Exactly. And the GTI doesn't shy away from any of it. And, well, that kind of instability, it's like a welcome mat for terrorist groups.
It creates all those openings, those cracks for them to exploit.
Sadly, yeah. And one of the biggest takeaways for me this year is the Sahel region. It's the epicenter, no question.
The Sahel. Wow, so it's even more so than, say, the Middle East.
Yeah, the Sahel is accounting for over half of all terrorism-related deaths globally.
That's huge. I know the region has its problems, but half.
It's a combination of factors, really. The GTI breaks it down: weak governance, ethnic tensions. You've got climate change hitting them hard.
Right, a recipe for instability.
And groups like JNIM they're thriving in that chaos.
GNIM, right? It's Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam, was all Muslim.
Exactly. And they're not just staying put either. They're expanding beyond the Sahel, hitting coastal West Africa now, too.
Oh, wow. So, where are we seeing that? Any examples?
Togo, for one. They've had their worst year ever for terrorism.
Togo. That's pretty far-reaching. Shows you how fluid these things are. But, okay, so the Sahel is a mess. That's clear. But aren't there, international efforts to help stabilize things?
There are, but there's a fascinating shift happening there, too, according to the GTI.
Oh, like what?
Well, Western influence is waning.
Really? I hadn't realized it was that noticeable.
The GTI says it's pretty clear. And at the same time, you've got Russia and China stepping up their presence.
Interesting. So it's like a power vacuum, and they're filling it.
In a way, yeah. They're offering security and economic support, but often with fewer strings attached than Western aid.
So more attractive to some of these struggling nations.
Potentially, yes. And you can't forget the elephant in the room, or rather, the bear in the room.
Russia and Ukraine.
Exactly. That conflict is having ripple effects everywhere, the Sahel included. It's impacting Russia's operations there, for one.
Right. Makes sense. They can't be everywhere at once.
And their information campaigns, their propaganda, it's reaching the Sahel, too, shaping opinions, adding to the instability.
Okay, so we've got a volatile region ripe for exploitation, declining Western influence, Russia and China making moves. And on top of that, the 2015 Algiers peace agreement fell apart, right?
Right, that was another blow. Things were already shaky in Mali, and that collapse just threw more fuel on the fire, created more opportunities for groups like JNIM to exploit.
It's a lot to process, honestly. Makes you realize how interconnected everything is. You can't just look at terrorism in isolation.
Couldn't agree more. It's all tied together. Global power dynamics, conflicts thousands of miles away, internal struggles. It's a web.
And it feels like that web is getting more and more tangled every year.
It really does. And speaking of tangled webs, there's another concerning trend highlighted in the Lone Wolf and Youth Terrorism report. We should probably unpack that too, right?
Oh, absolutely. That one was really eye-opening, the youth angle.
Yeah.
A whole other dimension to worry about.
It really is, and it's not getting any easier to address. But before we get too sidetracked, we were talking about ISIS. The GTI shows they're not just about holding territory anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like they've evolved, adapted their strategy.
Exactly. They're still the deadliest group out there, according to the GPI, but they're shifting away from that territorial control model. It's more about low-cost, high-impact attacks now.
Makes sense. Harder to target, harder to counter.
Exactly. And they're leveraging technology like never before. Drones, online propaganda, they're maximizing their reach and impact with those
It's
tools.
almost like they're mirroring those smaller, more fragmented groups we talked about earlier. They're becoming more agile, harder to pin down.
That's a great point, and it makes them all the more dangerous. But even with this shift, we can't forget about specific branches like ISIS-K. They're operating in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the report highlights them as a particular concern.
ISIS-K, yeah. What makes them so different from the main ISIS group?
Well, a couple of things stand out. They seem laser-focused on hitting foreign interests, for one, and there are signs they're not content with just regional influence. They've got global aspirations.
Wow, okay. So they're up in the ante. Anything else?
Their media game is strong, like seriously sophisticated. They're using it to reach audiences they could have only dreamed of before.
So they're tech savvy, they're targeting international interests, and they're thinking globally. That's a pretty potent combination.
It is. It's definitely something to keep an eye on. And speaking of things to keep an eye on, we've talked a lot about these jihadist groups, but we can't ignore the rise of right-wing terrorism. We touched on it earlier, but that EU terrorism situation and trend report, the TSAT, really highlighted it as a growing concern.
Oh, absolutely. That was a stark warning, especially for the EU.
It was. And it's not just the increase in incidents, it's this trend of convergence between right-wing and jihadist ideologies, especially online.
Convergence, like they're finding common ground.
It's disturbing, but yes, they're finding that common ground in their hatred of the other, whether it's immigrants, minorities, governments. It's a shared animosity that transcends their ideological differences.
That's pretty scary, honestly. And the fact that it's happening online makes it even harder to track and counter, right?
Absolutely. It adds another layer of complexity to an already complex problem. And while we're talking about interconnected challenges, we really can't leave out climate change. The TSAT report was very clear about its role as a threat multiplier.
Yeah, no kidding. It's like the backdrop to everything these days.
It is, and the report gives specific examples of how groups like Boko Haram and al-Shabaab are exploiting climate change. Droughts, famines, displacement. It all creates instability that they can capitalize on.
It's like they're offering these twisted solutions to climate-related problems. And with climate change only getting worse, it's a recipe for disaster.
I agree, it's a deeply concerning trend. But shifting gears a bit, I think it's important to highlight that it's not just the actors involved in terrorism that are changing. The nature of terrorism itself is evolving.
Oh, interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, both the GTI and the TSAT emphasize the increasing fragmentation of the terrorist landscape. We're not just dealing with these monolithic groups like ISIS or al-Qaeda anymore.
So it's more diffuse, more spread out.
Exactly. It's becoming more decentralized. These organizations are operating through loosely affiliated networks, regional branches. It's like trying to hit a moving target that's constantly splitting into smaller, more agile fragments.
And that makes them harder to track, harder to target. It's a whole new ballgame.
It really is. And on top of that, you've got this shift in the geographic focus of terrorism, with the Sahel emerging as this global epicenter. It highlights how interconnected everything is. Events in one part of the world, like the war in Ukraine, can ripple out and create instability elsewhere, like in the Sahel. The GTI makes that connection quite explicitly.
It all comes back to that web we talked about, right? Everything's tangled up, influencing everything else.
It is, and it's a web that's constantly evolving. But it's not just the actors and the locations that are changing, the tactics are evolving too. And both reports, the GTI and the TSAT, really stress the growing use of technology by these groups.
Right. We talked about ISIS using drones and online propaganda, but it sounds like it's more widespread than that.
It is. Drones are becoming more common across the board, not just for attacks, but for surveillance, even for propaganda purposes. And of course, you can't underestimate the role of online platforms. They're essential for recruitment, propaganda, fundraising, and it's all happening online.
It's that double-edged sword, right? Technology can connect and empower us, but it also gives these groups new tools and a wider reach. It's a tough challenge to navigate.
Oh.
No kidding. It feels like we're always one step behind trying to catch up with these new threats and these new tactics. But okay, we've covered a lot. Trends, challenges, how the whole nature of terrorism is changing. So big picture time. What are the key takeaways here? What should our listeners really walk away with from this deep dive into the GTI 2025 and all these other reports?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that you can't look at terrorism as this, isolated thing. It's not. It's connected to everything else that's going on in the world. Fragile states, climate change, technology. you name it.
It's like we said earlier, it's all one big tangled web.
Exactly. And that leads to another big takeaway. If we really want to counter terrorism, we need a more holistic approach. It can't just be about, military action or intelligence gathering. We have to address the root causes. We need to look at things like weak governance, corruption, inequality, even climate change. Those are all factors.
So it's about making the world more resilient overall, making it harder for these groups to take root in the first place.
That's a great way to put it. And that brings us to another really important point. This has got to be a whole of society effort.
Okay, yeah, so what does that even look like? What can everyday people do? Because, honestly, it's easy to feel totally overwhelmed by all of this. Like, what difference can I possibly make?
I get it. It can be overwhelming. But even small actions can make a difference. Staying informed is huge. Reports like the GTI and the FSI, those are great resources. And, engage in those difficult conversations. Challenge those extremist narratives whenever you see them, whether it's online or in person. Support those organizations that are working to promote peace and stability. There's a lot you can do, even as an individual.
I like that. It's about empowering people, not just making them feel helpless. And speaking of empowerment, the reports also talk about the power of strategic communication, right? It's a tool for both sides, the terrorist groups and those fighting against them.
Absolutely. Those groups, they use propaganda and disinformation to sow fear and distrust. And they're getting more and more sophisticated at tailoring their message to specific audiences, online platforms. Those are their playground.
So it's almost like an information war that's running parallel to the actual, physical one. So how do we fight back on that front?
For starters, we need to become more discerning consumers of information. We need to be able to spot those false narratives, call them out. But it's also about providing positive alternatives, messages of hope and resilience and inclusivity, things that really resonate with people, especially those who might be susceptible to extremist recruitment.
It's about winning hearts and minds, not just battles. Creating a world where those hateful ideologies just lose their appeal.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's probably time to wrap up this deep dive. It's been, a lot to digest.
It has. Definitely a heavy topic, but a crucial one. So for our listeners out there, remember, knowledge is power, stay informed, stay engaged, and don't ever underestimate the power you have to make a difference. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, stay curious.